Hi everyone, you're listening to Let's Psyconnect. This is LT.
This is Ronnie.
You might also be watching us, so if you are just listening to us, know that this episode is also available on YouTube as well as Instagram Live. And we're also going to be adding the link other platforms. So go to our website, letspsyconnect.com for more information. Today we have the pleasure of psyconnecting with a special guest here. Ronnie is going to do an introduction in a little bit. We have a series that focuses on trauma. And we have covered a couple of things, here and there that research has shown to be related to trauma. But today we want to talk more in depth with another professional in the field that we have, as I said, the pleasure of psyconnecting with, to talk about trauma, PTSD, and the connection between trauma and the body. And I hope you guys enjoy this conversation and learn a little bit about information, if not a lot. And if you want to send us an email, send it to discussion@letspsyconnect.com so we continue the conversation going. So Ronnie, go ahead.
Definitely. Thank you for that intro, LT. I'm super excited to be introducing Megan Chang today. I'm also very excited about our conversation. We're going to talk quite a bit about trauma and, as you mentioned, that relationship with the body. And I think sometimes that piece gets left out when trauma talk happens. So I'm happy to dive into it. So without further ado, Megan Chang is a PhD candidate in health sciences at York University, specializing in behavior change, mental performance, psychophysiology, and cognitive neuroscience. As part of her doctoral research, Megan developed the first registered clinical trial in Canada, investigating the effectiveness of an online mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral intervention for adults diagnosed with PTSD. Megan has worked as a mental health coach with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and University Health Network in Toronto. She is a certified meditation and yoga teacher on the Insight Timer app, the #1 free meditation app for sleep, anxiety, and stress, and has published 5 first authored research papers in behavioral health journals. So welcome to the podcast, Megan.
Oh, thank you so much. And honestly, I know I've said this before we started recording. It's just amazing to be able to connect. And I know we're all in different places around the world. So I'm really grateful that you invited me to do this. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and it's just because Ronnie and I, we have background in, we have strong interest in health psychology. So it's really about understanding how the body responds to medical conditions, yes, and also not medical conditions, or what would be considered as traditional medical conditions, right? And so we got excited when we came across your profile. And so we're so glad that we have this opportunity here to understand more about it and talk to somebody else, because Ronnie and I, we talk all the time. So now we get a chance to talk to somebody else. So tell us a little bit about your journey through becoming a PhD student and also through becoming more interested in this topic per se.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, first and foremost, I echo your passion with health psychology. I actually come to my PhD with a kinesiology background. So for people on listening in, kinesiology is really looking at the study of the human body in terms of movement and exercise. And I really loved the idea of keeping people out of the hospital. So this idea of prevention-based work around exercise psychology and sports psychology. And, when I finished my master's degree in kinesiology, I immediately entered the healthcare industry. I worked in hospice palliative care settings, and then I worked in cancer prevention and really working with individuals who were diagnosed with life-limiting illnesses, how to bring a sense of holistic wellness and well-being to their lives while they were navigating such a difficult time in their lives. And I had no intention at all to do my PhD. I thought I was done. And during one of the campaigns I was leading for colon cancer research, I reached out to my now supervisor at York University because we were using some of his research, just thanking him. You know how you want to tell people that their work is being used. So I sent him an email and said, thank you so much. We're embedding your knowledge into our cancer prevention strategy. And he just started the dialogue, and he, asked about what I was doing and asked, would you ever consider doing your PhD? And I was like, nope, I'm good. And, we talked more, and here we are. He's a clinical psychologist by background, and I have a kinesiology background. So we've actually come together to develop a health psychology intervention looking at elements of movement and exercise with traditional psychotherapy to help people with PTSD. So yeah, so that's a little background about how I came to this program, and I am in love with this research. I think trauma affects us all in some way, shape, or form, whether we've experienced something directly or witnessed something or had a loved one go through something traumatic. So this idea of using the body in healing, you know, the psychological trauma from events that occur in our lives just was really interesting to me. So that's where I am.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's the whole picture too of how students that go into a doctor program that don't necessarily go straight from a bachelor's program, right? It wasn't the case for myself. Ronnie, I don't know. but it's just, you know, there are people out there who don't go straight from a bachelor's degree to a PhD or PsyD program. And so there are opportunities like, hey, if you think that you're never gonna go back to school, there's an opportunity. You can still go back to school. So thank you for sharing that. And for your passion, because it's much needed in this field. You know, we know that it affects mental health professionals or researchers as well, who work not only like if you're just doing the research, but also, you know, because you go home with that content that you're learning and you are talking about, so again, it can affect the mental health of those who are trying to learn more about trauma, and self-care is important.
You're making such a good point, because had I not had the 5 years experience in the healthcare industry, I don't think I would have fully understood the impact of what it's like to be a frontline worker. And, you know, especially as we're talking in the middle of a pandemic, like, you're absolutely right. I think this vicarious trauma of taking home other people's pain is something that largely gets missed when we are looking at trauma and PTSD. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Definitely. And not to mention just the experience that you bring in just on an academic level, right? So with your background coming in and knowing a lot of these health concepts, knowing how the body functions and how complex our body is, and that interaction between the mind and the body, it kind of sets you up kind of for this path. So you touch on trauma a little bit, Megan, and I want to jump back there. So let's just start off by a basic question. What is trauma to you?
Yeah, and I think, you know, what you said about the mind-body connection, I'll invite people to consider this as the foundation of how I'm going to define trauma. We do such a good job as researchers really looking at the psychological impact of trauma. And we spend a lot of time trying to rigorously define what events constitute trauma. And I really believe that a large number of people are walking around disqualifying themselves or believe they don't fit in to the current criteria of what trauma is. And, you know, most psychologists and psychiatrists look to the American Psychiatric Association for the guiding diagnostic criteria. So their definition of trauma is, you know, an event, and typically a single shock trauma or acute trauma that occurs that threatens somebody's life or imminently puts them in danger or constitutes sexual violence. And, you know, that's a reference point. I think that's a really strong reference point. But if you look at that definition, I personally believe there's a lot of gray areas missed in terms of, you know, what about traumas that aren't single? What about traumas that are more multiple or repetitive in nature? Or traumatic experiences like repetitive bullying, racialized trauma, birth stress, you know, pre-postnatal traumas. There's so many types of traumas that don't actually fit nicely in the way that the definition is. So when you ask me what my definition of trauma is, I really like to look at the commonalities. What are the objective ways that we can define trauma? And the best way we can do that is look at what the trauma response is in the body, because regardless of whether you, LT, or you, Ronnie, or I could have 3 different experiences, but there are common ways that our body responds to a traumatic event. And namely, that's, I don't know how much you want me to go into detail, but namely that is, I know, I'm talking for hours. You know, we have this incredible system in our body, like our fight, flight, freeze system. And humans and animals have this capacity where we detect danger and the body prepares itself to flee or fight to get out of that danger. And how I look at trauma is, you know, after the danger is gone, we typically can then move into rest and relaxation in our bodies. But trauma to me is a disruption in that cycle. We don't actually get to that rest and relaxation. We still stay chronically activated, thinking that the threat or danger will occur at any time. And the interesting thing about humans is we don't know the difference between a real or an imagined threat. So long ago, trauma was, you know, not being attacked by a tiger or bear or a neighboring community. And nowadays, it's more of that psychological stress, this compound effect of imagined threat. And, you know, I try to explain this with clients, like in a nightmare scenario, you're not consciously being threatened, but if you're dreaming of something threatening, your body is still responding the same way it would if you were actually in that event. So trauma to me is really a disrupted nervous system response to an event that has happened. And I like to not worry about what the event is, because I think we deny the experience of so many people when we try to define the experience. So I like to look at it from a body perspective.
Yeah, and you touched on, and well, thank you for this description, because I know you know, sometimes we're trained on the DSM-5, or if you were trained on the DSM-4 or whatever version, we now use the DSM-5 in ways, and then so in one way we follow that, and we also, in a more holistic way, we attempt to accommodate other variables that sometimes the criteria, even though we try to follow that, right, sometimes there's that gray area, and or it doesn't even touch on other elements that we see that might be common when it comes to traumatic experiences. And research, again, informs us, and I guess humans who are also expressing their feelings and emotions are also telling us more about what it really means to them. As you said, like racial trauma and other situations that are not necessarily categorized as PTSD per se, per the category, we can see how it can affect the person, and we still refer to it as trauma.
For sure. And I think you touch on such a perfect point right now, because we're in this, you know, time in history where there is this rise of recognizing the lived experience of people who have been oppressed and marginalized for so long. And, you know, defining trauma and understanding, you know, diagnoses is inherently political, right? So, you know, I don't want to get too much into the politics of it, but when we broaden our view of what trauma actually is, you know, it means we have to admit things that we've been denying or silencing for so long. And so, you know, my hope through my research is to find ways to bring voice to some of the missed lived experience that we're seeing. So not an easy task, and I know you share that, but yeah.
I do want to touch on something else that you mentioned. I know Ronnie wants to say something too. So you alluded to the trauma experience too, or the conceptualization of trauma, as also something that other people have talked to me about, supervisors and whatnot, mentioning it in a way that they see it as anxiety response, right? The fight or flight, and then what happens in your body. And thinking about the avoidance, also the intrusive thoughts, so then go looking at the criterion. But what really happens in our bodies is very much related to what anxiety brings on, right? And the fear response, what do I do? Because I'm afraid that something's gonna happen. So, and what is similar to that, that's anxiety, right? And then with the DSM-5, there is a differentiation based on the criterion, but it's still very similar to anxiety.
Correct. Yeah. some change, I mean, some evolutions in the DSM have happened where, you know, PTSD in DSM-4 was considered an anxiety related disorder, and now in DSM-5 it's a trauma and stress related disorder. So there are some changes that may or may not, I don't quite fully know, but may impact who gets diagnosed versus who doesn't. So yeah, it's an ongoing discussion, and that's why I'm so grateful that you guys wanted to do this, because, you know, I think the way forward is really understanding multiple perspectives. So yeah.
Yeah. So I'll add a couple things, and I'll keep it short because I feel like we could talk about just this specific question.
I know, I'm like fired up.
The whole hour, but I appreciate what both of you said, and really not necessarily naming a specific trauma or saying, okay, this trauma is greater than this, because I think everyone's experience is different, right? Trauma is very individualized, and a lot of times in the past, we have, and I say we as a society have made the mistake of labeling, you know, which trauma is more important, or which trauma has more maladaptive symptoms, right? So I appreciate you giving a definition that includes multiple traumas, right? If it's complex trauma, prenatal trauma, all of these are the same in some sense of the word. And with that also being said, you described the body's response, I think, quite eloquently and easy for our listeners to kind of understand this anxiety piece that you touched on, LT, about what happens in the body when we are experiencing trauma or have experienced trauma in the past. And I think specifically about individuals who maybe didn't know that they were experiencing a trauma or going through something traumatic, but they're having this response in their body. And I know just explaining to them the function of the sympathetic nervous system and what happens when that's hyperactive, right? Or when the parasympathetic is blunted and we can't bring that down, right? And so for them, even if they aren't well versed in trauma talk or don't have the insight of their trauma, they're able to understand it from these biological perspectives. Like, oh, okay, so my sympathetic nervous system is hyperactive, which is why I'm feeling this type of way. So I just wanted to share that. Well, appreciate that.
I think exactly. Like, I think if we can start to, especially if there's somebody listening that has maybe denied their experience because they don't think it's as bad as somebody else's, you know, that's why I'm so passionate about getting people to really tune into their bodily sensations. One of the other systems in our body that doesn't get talked about a lot, but you know, you're absolutely right, that sympathetic dominance, that overdrive of fight or flight, there gets to be a point where that gets so overwhelming for somebody that they actually move into an immobility phase. This is often referred to as dissociation or numbing, or, you know, feeling separate from the body. And when you get to that point, that's the freeze state where, you know, essentially the body is completely overwhelmed and you go into this, you know, freeze immobility state. And it's actually, a lot of people think, oh, what's wrong with me? That I don't feel like I'm in my body. And, you know, again, I want to normalize that is a very common response. And it's actually your body's way of helping you survive the overwhelm that you're experiencing. So oftentimes, you know, people who have been through, you know, horrific events like held captive, rape, you know, really intense events, this immobility phase actually will kick in as a survival tactic, because if death is imminent, the body actually goes into dissociation to, if death is going to happen, it's going to alleviate the consciousness of that, so to speak. But then what happens after maybe the danger is no longer present is you can still have the capacity to move into this immobility phase, even if there's no danger present. And that's where, you know, really understanding the body is so important, because you might walk around thinking my body's betraying me, something's wrong with me. And it's like, no, 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 no. Your body is actually fighting for your survival. It's just disrupted right now. And so I just like to mention that because we look at fight or flight a lot and forget about the like freeze state too.
Yeah, exactly. And so we are touching on several ways that trauma affects the body. So focusing on the brain. So let's now talk more about, I guess, maybe specific areas of the brain. I know research has shown there is the Broca's areas activated. We can talk about epigenetics, and also we'd love to talk about how the body responds to trauma in a more physical way, if that makes sense. So we have heard about this book, and the term is out there too, how the body keeps track of trauma.
Yeah, actually, the foundation. So for anyone, this book by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, is the foundation of my research. And, you know, just high level overview in terms of the impact on the brain. So a couple of main areas. So the amygdala is a part of the brain that is our fear and threat and emotion detector. When trauma happens, that gets overactivated. And so basically what that means is we're constantly scanning the environment for threat and danger, even when threat and danger isn't present. So we just are now more likely to think things are threatening. So that's one that's very commonly known. Human beings have this amazing neocortex, prefrontal cortex area. So we can surf the internet, we can think, we can make decisions. When we get traumatized, unfortunately, this area of the brain deactivates. So this is the area of the brain that helps us control impulses and make decisions to help us respond versus react. So it deactivates, which means we're more reactive versus responsive. The hippocampus is a very interesting area. Doesn't get as much attention, but this is where memory formation occurs. And I know there's some controversy around trauma survivors and memory recall of the events. And when you look at what happens, and this is with like functional MRI machines, like there's evidence that the hippocampus deactivates, and that can cause fragments of memories, that can cause you know, difficulties recalling the chronological order of events. It kind of distorts when the memories happen. And again, that's a survival mechanism that we think something's wrong with us, but that's actually, again, your body's way of surviving. And then you mentioned the Broca's area. And it's like one of my most favorite areas to really think about, because we typically focus so much on talk therapy to treat PTSD and trauma. And I think when we understand what happens to the Broca's area, we can start to recognize that talk therapy alone might be really difficult at first for people with trauma. So that's why I'm so passionate about body-based awareness. The Broca's area is our speech and language center. So our capacity to put verbal dialogue to our experience, to name, to discuss. And so a lot of people that I've worked with who've been through trauma really struggle with putting language to their experience. And this might explain why talk therapy feels really challenging. I'm not saying it's bad or wrong. I absolutely think it's necessary. It's just, it's an explanation why some people might find like, I'm not feeling better yet. And maybe that's because we need to explore how to make the body return to a sense of safety first before we enter into talk therapy. So those are more of like the brain regions. Talked about the autonomic nervous system a little bit. What else do you want to know?
Yeah, I want to know how the body keeps a score. And if you, before that, if you can touch on the epigenetics, like what research has shown, or you're familiar with how the trauma is associated with genes and whatnot.
Yeah. So
go ahead, Ronnie.
Sorry, before you touch on that, I just want to say something. So let me see if I am correct about this, or if I'm understanding you correctly. So it seems like you're saying that research shows that it may be more beneficial to have the patient or individual who has the history of trauma of any kind, have them understand that the physiological and body changes that occur before working on maybe going back and doing any work on the actual trauma or PTSD. So focusing more on grounding, mindfulness, helping to bring that sympathetic nervous system down a bit from that aroused state. Is that generally?
Yeah, I would never discourage someone from going through talk therapy. I would say bring in combination with
Right.
some body-based psychosomatic work. Again, because trauma is a felt sense in the body, and to have those practices to become aware of, in tune with, what is our body doing? And we can talk about like proprioception, so understanding your body in space, and that helps with association, things like that. I would say in conjunction with, I would say blend them together.
Yeah, so and I'll just share that I actually agree with you, and partly because I've had some run-ins with either vignettes or different cases, nothing personally, or for my case, but where the individual has gone through some trauma-related therapeutic intervention, right? And then afterwards, so after that, the protocol period, they were mentioning still feeling this arousal at certain times and had no idea why. I don't feel, any of these symptoms related to PTSD, but for some reason at this time, I'm still feeling my sympathetic system becoming aroused, or this time I still can't sleep and I don't know why. I don't, psychologically, I don't have any of these deficits. So from what you said, it does make a lot of sense, right? So, working on the biological piece, maybe a little bit before the psychological can set you up for long-term success. So, yeah, I agree with that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, no problem. So epigenetics, that's a huge word. It's not my primary area, but certainly is definitely of interest to me, because I think it's growing. Like, the field is still relatively new, it's still unclear, but epi means above and genetics means genes. So this idea of changes to gene expression that don't actually alter the genetic makeup itself. And epigenetics is a field that's thought to really understand the influence of gene expression from external stimuli like your environment, or in this case, exposure to trauma. And so there's some studies, mostly with Holocaust survivors, refugees from war-torn countries, the adverse, I know in the States, the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Events Research. This is where epigenetics is emerging and looking at if parents of the Holocaust have survived. Epigenetics is saying that children of parents from the Holocaust are more likely to present with PTSD symptoms. It's like this idea of transmission of genes passed on down the family generation line. And I think this is such powerful work, because I think it explains a lot of things like historical traumas, racialized trauma, etc. People don't necessarily have to have directly maybe experienced the horror of like the Holocaust or slavery or whatever it is, but they might be experiencing or presenting with similar feelings of trauma or PTSD and unsure why. And epigenetics is a possible explanation for that. I don't really know too much more about it, but it is emerging.
Yeah, and I think this puts it in more context, right? There's so much to talk about when it comes to trauma. We didn't even get to talk about complex trauma. There's so much more. We did touch on this topic in our episode, Let's Psyconnect with Laura Lu. So if you want more information, go to that episode as well. But let's talk about how the body keeps a score. Come on.
Okay, what specifically, where do you want me to focus on that?
If you can just give us more reference. So for instance, I've said it before, like I'm passionate about pain. And so I know there's trauma in pain. So People experience pain and they don't know where it's coming from. They go to the doctor says, no, there's no medical condition. So what's going on with me?
So I think exactly what you're saying is a very common experience where people are presenting with a host of symptoms. They're doing all these tests, but everything is coming back normal. And it's like, there's got to be something. So because we've talked briefly about the impact of trauma on the autonomic nervous system and the brain, we can't forget that these systems are largely involved in releasing stress hormones. These systems are largely involved in our immune system. These systems, you know, look after regulating our neuroendocrine system. So all these complex systems in our body get altered, essentially. So it's interesting because in my research, I didn't originally put a pain measure in the baseline metrics. And I started to notice after about the 5th or 6th participant, I'm like, this can't just be coincidence. So anecdotally, and if I can find a reference, I'll send it. I'm sure there's lots out there. But anecdotally, a number out of the 5 or 6 participants that I first started with, you know, common things like fibromyalgia, autoimmune disorders, chronic fatigue syndrome, pelvic inflammatory disease, pelvic floor dysfunction, PCOS, like polycystic ovarian syndrome. These types of symptoms came up more than, it just was not something that was random to me. And I was like, what is going on? So then we did embed like a pain measure halfway through because I was like, there has to be something here. And there is. Like, my sample size is a little bit small, but definitely noticing that these types of inflammatory conditions are quite common. And if you think about, you know, the body keeps the score, if we've got unresolved trauma within us, or if we've got a disrupted stress response where we can't discharge the energy of the trauma, that wreaks havoc on all of our systems in our body. It causes inflammation, you know, stress and cortisol and all these different hormones that are released absolutely can link to chronic pain type symptoms. So anecdotally, I definitely believe that. I wish I had more of like a research foundation for you, but Bessel van der Kolk is one of the leading pioneering researchers that really talks about all the functions of the body that get disrupted after a traumatic event. And my research really focuses on the autonomic nervous system. So I don't quite know enough to feel confident to give you all the info about
good. LT, a response, LT?
Yeah, that was great, actually. That was a great summary overview of what's going on. Research does show that, you know, as a child who has experienced a traumatic experience, they're more likely to suffer and be diagnosed and receive treatment for chronic pain later on as well. There's also a strong association between trauma, somatization of disorders as a diagnosis. There's debate on that one because a lot of the medical professionals, they don't really know what to do with that either. Based on the knowledge of now. And so there's also IBS, chronic fatigue, gastrointestinal, not just IBS, but other gastrointestinal disorders and complications because, again, of what they unresolved trauma. Now we're talking about the inflammatory response, right? And then what else is associated with that? Like, what are some medical conditions associated with that? We have cardiovascular diseases, we have diabetes, we have blood pressure, right? So
well, if you look at, there's like a beautiful diagram in the CDC research on adverse childhood experiences that basically shows exactly what you're saying. Like, early exposure to trauma leads to disrupted neurobiology, which leads to higher risk of chronic disease, which leads to higher risk of like all-cause mortality. And, you know, I really feel for the people who are out there right now that are spending time and money trying to figure out what is going on in their body, because I think you're absolutely right. Like, a lot of clinicians think, well, everything's normal, but you know your body best. And if you're feeling something, you know, it may be unresolved aspects of a traumatic event. Not always, but it's a likely possibility.
Right. It could be, and I know that with this conversation we've floated out a lot of I guess more medical jargon, right? But I think that if anything to take away from this, especially individuals listening who are striving to be clinicians at some point, is, you know, if someone is presenting with with something like chronic pain or some underlying condition that you can't really put your finger on, I think that is a great time, and even before that, honestly, to really start asking some of these more psychological questions, and it fits perfectly into the role of a health psychologist or anybody in behavioral medicine, right? And going that extra step.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think we can't underestimate the integrated approach to understanding symptoms. Like, you know, the medical model is very common in the US and in Canada, where we treat the symptoms, we don't treat the underlying root cause. And I really appreciate that you said that, because I think as clinicians, we could be doing more to really assess the whole person. So I agree with you 100%.
And it's important, and I think we try to advocate for that during our training too. It's just a lot of people, or I don't know how many people, but there are professionals to be out there who don't see the need to have these health psych hats, and they want to be called or known as journalist or this X, Y, and Z and whatnot, not taking into account how the body responds to all those emotional responses or experiences that they went through in life. And so if they do see somebody who has diagnosis of diabetes or pain or etc., they don't see the connection, or well, some of them don't see the connection between the mental health symptoms and how the body responds to that. And so they might be treating something that, might actually improve the medical health symptoms, whereas sometimes it's also important to focus on stabilizing or even improving the medical health symptoms that will lead to improvements in the mental health symptoms. Because again, the medical symptoms are triggering and activating the inflammatory system, right? Or the process of inflammation, I shouldn't say system necessarily, which is leading to, or potentially leading to, depression. So that's where it's very important to, again, try to differentiate, if possible, or when possible, if it is the medical or the physical that's causing or contributing to the mental health symptoms, rather than the other way around. Yeah.
For sure. And I've never seen the mind and body as separate entities ever. And yet in traditional medicine, we're taught to treat the physical symptoms first. So, and it's not a criticism, it's the system. So, you know, I'm so glad, again, having this conversation, and hopefully people can integrate the two a little bit more here.
Yeah. I know we didn't get to talk about your research project. We had an awesome conversation, at least I think so. I do want to ask, so how can people learn more about research or get in touch with you to learn more about that and anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. So details about the program that I ran for my dissertation is found at healmytraumaimprint.com. And you can email me with questions at info@healmytraumaimprint.com. To just quickly add about the clinical trial, so the novelty of it was that we used measures of heart rate variability and pupillometry, so really high-tech glasses with cool lasers and things like that, to look at the autonomic response to emotional threatening images. And then we actually had people go through a guided meditation, and we monitored what was happening to the nervous system. And so people with PTSD actually have a blunted heart rate variability. It's not adapting or flexible compared to people who don't have PTSD. And as you were saying about the body keeps the score, a low heart rate variability is associated with cardiovascular disease, all-cause mortality, risk of a lot of different conditions. So we did essentially find that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Is there anything else you want to add, and maybe about your research? We have a couple more minutes. or how the people can maybe join your program too?
Yeah, so I mean, I think as we wrap up, I think what I'm taking away from this conversation is just how important it is to view individuals presenting with symptoms from that holistic integrated lens. And I really believe you to walk that walk and talk that talk. And I just think how lucky people in your presence are to have you treat them as a whole person. And you know, I love the field of health psychology. I love what you're doing. So it's more just, I'm grateful for the work that you do. And I just wanted to mention that because I think a lot of people are silently walking around feeling like they don't qualify for PTSD or trauma-related symptoms because the way we've rigidly tried to put it in this categorical box. And so I just really, again, appreciate this conversation, and hopefully we can expand our view a little bit.
You made me speechless, so Ronnie, please say something.
Thank you so much, Megan. And you know, I think that the feeling is definitely likewise. You know, and I'm a little biased to this topic, of course, but a conversation like this, it really illuminates, you know, how much need there is for health psychology in every discipline. And we could have another conversation about this later, but you know, if you look at really any discipline within medicine or within psychology, all the specializations, they most likely all include some form of that medical aspect, right? And including that and vice versa, because it is a bi-directional relationship. It is our duty as thriving psychologists and future psychologists, as well as individuals starting in the field already, right? So
yeah,
even as you mentioned, general psychology, still need that.
I was going to say one takeaway for anyone who's like, where do I start? We cannot underestimate the power of our breath, particularly our exhale breath. When we exhale deeply, we go into that parasympathetic rest and digest state. So for anyone watching who's like, where do I even begin? Just start breathing and consciously being aware of your breath.
It's just funny because as soon as you said breath, I just...
Right? I know. Like,
do mindfulness exercise.
Right? We think it's so simple, but it really does impact our body. So I'll say start there, and yeah.
And as much as we want to improve or help improve, let's say, the medical field to incorporate the biopsychosocial model and also to take into account the mental health of the patients, it's also important for the mental health professionals to acknowledge the medical health, the physical health, and how that is associated and affiliated with the mental health. And rather than just say depression is depression, there's nothing to do with the physical health.
So true.
Yeah.
So true.
And with that, I just want to say thank you so much. I can talk again.
I really want to continue the conversation. You guys are amazing. And when I'm done the write-up of my dissertation, if you want to hear some of the results, I would love to share them.
Of course, we were so research informed, so it'll be really, really nice to have somebody to talk about something that was like their baby and they saw it grow, and the challenges with that as well. So thank you for that, and looking forward to chatting with you soon, or connecting with you more very soon.
Thank you.
And to those of you out there who stay connected with us in between episodes, we are on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, on YouTube, and go to our website, letspsyconnect.com, to stay up to date with our plans as well as episodes. And our podcast is available in all major podcast platforms. And remember, let's connect.